The deadbolt clicked before I fully understood what was happening. It was such a small sound. Clean. Ordinary. The kind of sound you hear every night without thinking about it. But standing there on Walter and Judith Hale's front porch with my 5-week-old son shaking against my chest, that little click sounded like the end of my entire life. Snow whipped sideways across the porch light. The wind cut through the thin cotton of my sweatshirt so sharply it felt wet against my skin. Oliver let out a thin, exhausted cry. The kind newborns make when they're too cold and too tired to even scream properly anymore, and I pulled the blanket tighter around his tiny face with hands that barely worked. Inside the house, everything still looked warm. The kitchen lights glowed soft gold against polished cabinets. I could see the edge of the dining table through the glass beside the door. Judith's cream-colored sweater. Walter, standing near the fireplace with one hand in his pocket like this, was a business discussion instead of a mother and child being left outside in a snowstorm. And Ethan, my husband, stood behind them, silent. That hurt worse than the cold. Judith opened the door just enough for heat to spill through the crack. Her voice stayed perfectly calm, perfectly controlled. "Cassandra," she said softly, "you're upsetting the baby." I stared at her, snow melting into my eyelashes. "He's cold. We're trying to help," Walter said from farther inside. "But right now you are not emotionally regulated enough to care for that child." That phrase, emotionally regulated, like I was some unstable stranger instead of Oliver's mother. I tightened my arms around my son. "I'm not giving you my baby." Judith's expression hardened for half a second before smoothing itself again. "Then you need to calm down somewhere else tonight." And then Ethan finally spoke. Not to me, to his father. "Lock the door." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Walter reached over calmly and turned the deadbolt again while looking directly at me through the glass. Oliver started coughing against my chest. I turned away from the house instinctively, trying to shield him from the wind, panic rising so fast I could barely breathe myself. My phone was still inside. My coat too. Everything was inside that house, except me. Then headlights swept across the driveway. A dark Lincoln Navigator rolled slowly through the falling snow before stopping beside the curb. The driver's door opened, and a tall gray-haired man stepped out into the storm. At first, he only looked concerned. Then his eyes landed on the silver necklace hanging half-hidden beneath Oliver's blanket. His entire face changed. He took one slow step toward me, staring like he'd seen a ghost rise out of the snow. "My God," he whispered. His voice broke slightly. "That necklace." I froze. The wind howled between us. Then he looked directly into my face and said the words that made the whole world stop moving. "You're Evelyn Mercer's daughter. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 78% right now, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right." All right. Enough talking. Let's begin the story. For a second, I honestly thought the cold had finally gotten to me. Snow blew across the driveway in white sheets, stinging my face, and I just stood there staring at this stranger while Oliver trembled against my chest beneath the blanket. Nobody had said my mother's name out loud to me in years. Not counselors. Not foster families. Not even the state paperwork that followed me from county to county in thick manila folders, with my life summarized in black ink and checkboxes. Evelyn Mercer. Most of the time, she didn't even feel real. She felt like something unfinished. A woman-shaped absence I had spent my entire life trying not to look at too directly. The man stepped closer, slower this time, careful not to frighten me. Snow had already settled across the shoulders of his dark wool coat. "My name is Vincent Rowe," he said quietly. "Your mother and I knew each other a long time ago. I should have asked questions immediately. Who are you? How do you know her? Why now?" But survival has its own hierarchy, and at that moment the only thing I could think about was Oliver's breathing. His tiny body felt frighteningly cold through the blanket. Vincent noticed it too. "You need to get him warm," he said, his voice tightening slightly. "Please, let me help you." Behind me, The Hale house remained bright and still. No one opened the door again. No one came outside. Through the front window, I could see Judith moving calmly through the kitchen, like she hadn't just left her grandson standing in a snowstorm. Something inside me cracked then. Not loudly. Quietly. The way ice splits underneath dark water. I nodded once. The heat inside Vincent's SUV hit my skin so fast it almost hurt. Oliver whimpered weakly while I rubbed his back beneath the blanket, trying to warm him with my hands. My own fingers had gone stiff and pale. Vincent turned the heater higher without saying anything else and pulled away from the curb. Only once the Hale house disappeared behind the trees did I finally realize I was shaking hard enough to rattle my teeth. I wish I could tell you that night was the first time I understood what kind of family I had married into. It wasn't. Families like the Hales don't destroy you all at once. They do it carefully, politely. They smile while they decide where you belong. And from the beginning, I had been someone they tolerated, not someone they truly accepted. Maybe I should explain that part. I grew up in foster care outside Syracuse, 8 homes by the time I turned 16. Some kind, some forgettable, some that taught me very early how to become quiet enough to keep from being sent away again. Everything I owned fit into black trash bags most of my childhood. Clothes, school papers, toothbrushes. You learn not to get attached to places when every door feels temporary. By 12, I had already stopped asking why nobody came back for me. And by 34, I had become very good at mistaking survival for belonging. I met Ethan Hale in late October, 6 years before the night his parents locked me out in the snow. Walter Hale had come into the respiratory unit after a minor cardiac episode during a charity golf event outside Rochester. Nothing life-threatening. Mostly ego damage, and elevated blood pressure. Ethan arrived 20 minutes later wearing a navy wool coat dusted with rain and carrying the kind of calm confidence that makes people move aside without realizing they're doing it. At the time, I mistook calm for safety. He brought coffee for the nurses on his second visit, remembered my name by the third. By Christmas, he was driving 40 minutes through sleet to bring me Thai takeout after double shifts at the hospital. Nobody had ever done things like that for me before. Nobody had ever acted like seeing me was the best part of their day. That's the dangerous thing about people who arrive when you've spent your whole life emotionally hungry. Kindness doesn't feel small. It feels like rescue. The first time I went to the Hale family home, Judith hugged me at the door and told me she'd heard so much about me. The house looked like something from a magazine spread. Stone fireplace. Warm lighting. Fresh cedar garland along the staircase at Christmas. Everything smelled faintly of expensive candles and red wine. I remember standing there holding a pie from the grocery store bakery and feeling suddenly aware of every foster home Christmas I'd ever had. Paper plates, folding tables, last names that weren't mine. Judith had a way of smiling that never quite reached her eyes. I noticed it early, but ignored it, because Ethan squeezed my hand under the dinner table whenever she said something uncomfortable. "Oh, Cassandra," she'd said once lightly over dessert, "you're so resilient. I can't imagine growing up without proper structure." Proper structure. Like I was a case study instead of a person. Walter was quieter. Men like Walter rarely needed to raise their voices. He asked questions the way accountants inspect damaged property. Did I know anything about my biological father? Had foster care affected my ability to form stable attachments? Was there any history of addiction or mental illness in my family records? At first, I told myself he was simply protective. Wealthy families liked information. That was how they operated. Ethan always defended them afterward. Dad's old-fashioned. Mom just worries. They'll soften once they know you better. But they never really tried to know me. They studied me instead. And after I became pregnant with Oliver, the studying turned into planning. Judith suddenly involved herself in everything. She replaced the nursery furniture I'd chosen because it was more practical to use the set she ordered from Connecticut. She started showing up at doctor appointments I never invited her to. Once, I came home from work and found her inside my kitchen reorganizing the cabinets, to make motherhood easier. The strangest part? Ethan let it happen. Little by little, decisions stopped feeling like mine. Money conversations happened between Ethan and Walter behind closed office doors. Judith insisted we revise the prenup now that a child was involved. And one evening, while folding baby clothes at their dining room table, I overheard Walter ask a question that made my stomach go cold. If custody ever became complicated, he said evenly, what support system would she realistically have? I told myself I had misheard Walter that night. People hear strange things when they're pregnant. Hormones sharpen fear and blur reason. At least, that's what I kept repeating to myself while lying awake beside Ethan afterward, staring at the faint blue glow of his phone lighting the ceiling at 2 a.m. He had started sleeping with the screen face down months earlier. At first, it was little things. A password change on our joint banking app he forgot to mention. Sudden irritation over grocery receipts. Quiet arguments with someone in his office behind closed doors that always stopped when I walked in. Whenever I asked if something was wrong, he'd rub both hands over his face and say the same thing. I'm handling it. But handling it slowly became another word for shutting me out. Oliver arrived 6 weeks early during the first snowstorm of January. Tiny, red-faced, breathing too fast. I still remember the sound of the NICU monitors that first night. The constant mechanical rhythm rising and falling around us while I sat in a hospital chair, pumping milk through tears because my body still hadn't understood. My baby was no longer inside it. I thought becoming parents might pull Ethan back toward me. Instead, it was like watching someone disappear behind fog. He held Oliver carefully, dutifully, but without softness. His mind always seemed somewhere else. Even at home, he moved through rooms distracted, tense, checking emails at midnight, stepping outside to answer calls he wouldn't take near me. And Judith started appearing almost daily after the birth, carrying casseroles and advice, and quiet authority, like she already belonged in the center of our house more than I did. One afternoon I came downstairs and found her standing in Oliver's nursery removing the framed animal prints I'd hung over the crib. The colors were overstimulating, she said calmly. Babies need order. She said it while placing my things into a cardboard box. Mine. Something about that image stayed with me afterward. Not because of the pictures themselves, but because she never asked. She simply decided. And the terrifying part was how quickly everyone adjusted around her decisions. Even Ethan. Especially Ethan. 3 weeks after Oliver came home, I tried accessing our savings account to pay a hospital balance. My password no longer worked. When I asked Ethan about it, something flickered across his face too fast to fully read. Oh, he said casually, loosening his tie. Dad suggested consolidating things temporarily. Easier for taxes. Taxes. Everything in the Hale family always sounded reasonable when spoken out loud. That night, while Ethan showered upstairs, his laptop lit up on the kitchen counter beside a stack of unopened mail. I wasn't trying to snoop. God knows I still wanted to believe there was an explanation for all of this. Then I saw the document title open on the screen. Emergency Temporary Custody Filing. My entire body went cold. I stared at the words while water ran through the pipes upstairs, and Oliver slept in his bassinet beside the couch, making those tiny newborn sighing noises in his sleep. Under the title was Ethan's name, and below that, one sentence, partially typed into the draft, concerns regarding maternal emotional stability. I didn't confront Ethan about the custody document right away. That's the part people who've never lived inside manipulation don't understand. When someone slowly teaches you to distrust your own instincts, even proof feels slippery in your hands. I kept staring at that sentence on the laptop screen, waiting for my brain to turn it into something harmless. Maybe it was precautionary paperwork. Maybe Walter's lawyers drafted things automatically. Maybe maternal emotional stability was just legal language that sounded uglier than it meant. By the time Ethan came downstairs, I had already closed the laptop. I hated myself for that. The next few days passed in a strange fog. Oliver had another pediatric follow-up because of his breathing, and I barely slept more than 40 minutes at a time. Everything in my body still hurt from childbirth. My stitches pulled when I walked too fast. My milk came in unevenly from stress. Sometimes I'd stand in the kitchen at 3 in the morning holding Oliver against my shoulder while snow fell outside the dark windows and feel like my entire life had narrowed into survival measured hour by hour. And through all of it, the hails kept circling. Judith began calling Oliver, our baby, without seeming to notice it. Walter started dropping by, unannounced with financial folders. Ethan suddenly needed signed. Ethan himself moved around me carefully now, almost cautiously, like someone approaching a nervous animal. That frightened me more than anger would have. The fight started on a Thursday night in February, after I found another envelope from a law office hidden beneath Ethan's briefcase in the mudroom. I didn't even open it this time. I just carried it into the kitchen while Oliver slept in his carrier beside the table. "What exactly are you planning?" I asked. Ethan froze near the sink. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed softly between us. Outside, wind pushed dry snow against the windows in scraping bursts. "You've been through a lot," he said finally, too carefully. "Everyone's worried about you. Everyone. Not him. Everyone." I felt something inside me harden. "Stop talking about me like I'm not standing here." His jaw tightened then. "You've been emotional for weeks." "I'm exhausted," I snapped. "There's a difference." The argument escalated quietly, which somehow made it worse. No screaming, no broken dishes, just years of buried control finally surfacing all at once. By 11 that night, Ethan insisted we needed space to cool down, and drove us through the storm to his parents' house. I should have realized then this had already been planned. Judith opened the front door before we even reached the porch. She was fully dressed. Makeup done. Lights already on downstairs. Waiting. Walter stood near the fireplace, holding a folded blanket for Oliver. Not for me. The moment I stepped inside, Judith reached for the baby automatically. "Let me take him while you calm yourself." I pulled back instinctively. "I'm fine." Walter exchanged a glance with Ethan. A quiet one. The kind people make when decisions have already happened somewhere without you. Then, Walter spoke in the same measured tone he used discussing investments over dinner. "Cassandra," he said, "right now you are not emotionally regulated enough to hold that child safely." I stared at him in disbelief. Oliver stirred against my chest, letting out a weak little cough. "I'm his mother, and we are trying to protect him," Judith replied softly. "Protect him? From me?" I turned toward Ethan then, waiting for him to stop this, to laugh awkwardly, to tell them they were out of line. Instead, he stepped between me and the front hallway. "Maybe you should stay somewhere else tonight," he said quietly. And suddenly I understood. They weren't trying to help me. They were trying to separate me from my son. The hospital emergency room smelled like antiseptic, overheated air, and burnt coffee from a machine that had probably been running for 20 years straight. By the time Vincent carried Oliver's infant seat through the sliding doors, my entire body had started trembling uncontrollably, not from cold anymore, but from the adrenaline crash that comes after fear finally realizes it survived. A pediatric nurse took Oliver first. That nearly broke me. Every protective instinct in my body resisted letting him out of my arms, but his breathing had turned shallow during the drive, little uneven pulls of air that made panic climb higher and higher into my throat. I stood there, while nurses checked his oxygen levels beneath bright fluorescent lights, and for the first time all night, nobody questioned whether I was his mother. Nobody looked at me like a problem to solve. A woman in navy scrubs touched my shoulder gently. "He's cold, but he's okay," she said. "You got him here in time. You got him here in time." Such a simple sentence. But after hours of being treated like a danger to my own child, those words hit me so hard I had to look away before I started crying in front of strangers. Vincent stayed near the hallway wall while doctors worked. He never hovered, never interrupted. Snow had melted into dark patches along the shoulders of his coat, and he looked exhausted in a way that seemed older than one bad night. Around 3 in the morning, after Oliver finally settled beneath warm blankets in a bassinet beside me, A hospital social worker stepped quietly into the room. Her badge read Naomi Pierce. She spoke carefully, not soft in a fake, comforting way. Just direct. Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight? The question sat between us longer than it should have. I should have answered yes immediately. Pride alone should have made me say it. But I was too tired to lie convincingly. Naomi glanced once toward the bruised red marks still visible across my wrists from where Ethan had grabbed me outside the Hale house. Her expression changed almost invisibly. Abuse doesn't always sound angry, she said quietly, while updating paperwork on her clipboard. Sometimes it sounds reasonable. I stared at her. That sentence unsettled me more than anything else had that night, because it reached directly into something I had been trying not to name. Reasonable. That was exactly how the Hales operated. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud enough to explain easily afterward. Just calm voices, legal words, concerned expressions, and decisions slowly made around me until I no longer recognized my own place inside my marriage. After Naomi left, silence settled over the room again, except for the distant hum of hospital machinery and Oliver's small, sleepy breaths. Vincent finally spoke then. "I loved your mother," he said. The words arrived without performance, no attempt to soften them. I looked up slowly. He sat forward slightly, hands clasped together, eyes fixed somewhere past the hospital floor instead of on me. 22 years ago, he continued quietly, your mother called me from a bus station outside Albany. She told me she was leaving with you. She sounded terrified. His jaw tightened briefly. I told her I'd come get both of you. Something heavy moved through my chest. What happened? I asked. For the first time since I'd met him, Vincent looked directly at me. I got there too late. The room felt suddenly smaller. Snow tapped softly against the hospital windows while Oliver slept beside me, completely unaware that the shape of his mother's entire life had just begun to change. Then Vincent said the sentence that made my stomach turn cold all over again. Cassandra, your husband's family knew more about your mother than they ever told you. I barely slept after Vincent said that. The hospital eventually moved Oliver and me into a small postpartum recovery room because the pediatric staff wanted to monitor his breathing through the morning. Around dawn, pale winter light began leaking through the blinds in thin gray stripes, washing everything in that exhausted color hospitals always seem to have before sunrise. Oliver slept curled against my chest while machines hummed softly around us, and I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying Vincent's words over and over. Your husband's family knew more about your mother than they ever told you. At first, my brain rejected it automatically. The Hales were many things: controlling, invasive, cold, but this sounded different. Older, buried, deeper. Still, once the thought entered my mind, memories began rearranging themselves in ways I could no longer ignore. Walter asking detailed questions about my sealed foster records. Judith pushing strangely hard for revisions to our prenup after I became pregnant. Ethan encouraging me to request old county documents in case there was medical history worth knowing. At the time, I thought they were trying to help me reclaim my past. Now it felt more like they had been searching for something. By noon, Vincent returned carrying coffee and a paper folder thick enough to bend slightly in his hands. He looked hesitant, standing near the doorway, like a man who already regretted what he was about to say. I need you to understand, he said quietly. I never stopped looking for you after your mother died. I sat up slowly in the hospital bed. Why? He exhaled through his nose once before answering. Because I promised her I would protect you. That sentence landed somewhere painful. Vincent pulled a chair closer and opened the folder carefully across his knee. Inside were copies of county property maps, trust documents, and legal correspondence old enough for the paper edges to yellow. Your mother was connected to a land trust outside Buffalo, he explained. Industrial property. Back then it wasn't worth much. Warehouses, rail access, nothing special. His eyes lifted toward mine, but the area changed over the last decade. Shipping expansion, distribution contracts, the value exploded. I stared at him, confused. What does that have to do with Ethan? A shadow crossed Vincent's face. 6 months ago, he said slowly, someone from Hale Logistics started requesting archived records tied to your mother's trust. My stomach tightened instantly. Hale Logistics. Walter's company. No, I whispered automatically, even though part of me already knew. Vincent reached into the folder again and slid over a printed request form. At the bottom sat Ethan's signature. The room suddenly felt too warm. He was looking into my mother? Vincent nodded once. And I don't think it was curiosity. Oliver stirred softly against me, his tiny fingers flexing in sleep, while my entire marriage seemed to split open in real time. Then Vincent said the part that finally shattered whatever denial I still had left. Cassandra, if the trust transfers legally, you could inherit property now worth close to $2 million. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. And all at once, every strange conversation from the last 2 years returned with horrifying clarity. Ethan asking whether I had copies of old paperwork. Walter insisting records mattered. Judith saying family assets needed protection before Oliver was born. Not protection from outsiders. Protection from me. Or worse, control over me. Vincent closed the folder quietly. The moment they realized you weren't powerless, he said carefully, you stopped being family to them. You became leverage. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 3. If not, type 4. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. Something inside me changed after that conversation. Not dramatically. There was no cinematic moment where I suddenly became fearless. Trauma doesn't work that way. Mostly, I just became quiet. The hospital discharged Oliver and me the following afternoon, but I didn't go back to the Hale house. Vincent offered the guest cottage behind his property outside Brighton, and exhaustion finally pushed me past pride. The cottage was small, 1 bedroom, old hardwood floors, a radiator that clicked loudly at night, but it was warm, and nobody there treated me like I needed permission to hold my own child. For the first 2 days, I barely left the couch except to feed Oliver or force myself to shower. My body still ached constantly. My milk supply dropped from stress. Sometimes I'd wake in panic because the silence felt unfamiliar after weeks of tension inside the Hale house. No footsteps, no Judith reorganizing drawers, no Ethan pacing through midnight phone calls. Just stillness. And inside that stillness, things became harder to ignore. Ethan called 12 times the first night. He never once asked if Oliver was breathing better. Instead, he left messages like, "You embarrassed my parents. We need to handle this privately. You're overreacting." Overreacting. I started noticing how often that word appeared whenever someone wanted a woman to distrust her own memory. On the 3rd morning, Naomi Pierce stopped by the cottage after her hospital shift. She carried grocery bags and spoke with the same calm practicality she'd had in the ER. While Oliver slept against my chest, Naomi sat across from me at the kitchen table and listened without interrupting, while I explained everything: the custody draft, the trust documents, the night in the snow. When I finally stopped talking, she folded her hands quietly. "Confused women are easier to control," she said. The sentence settled heavily into the room. "You keep trying to decide whether what happened was bad enough," she continued gently. "Healthy families don't make mothers question whether they're safe holding their own babies." I looked down at Oliver's tiny fingers curled against my sweater. For the first time, anger began pushing through the fog of fear. Not loud anger, clear anger. That afternoon, I opened a new email account and started organizing everything. Bank statements, screenshots, hospital paperwork, text messages. The deeper I looked, the uglier things became. Ethan hadn't just hidden debt, he'd buried it. Credit cards I never knew existed, personal loans, gambling transactions disguised as business expenses. Nearly $92,000 gone. And then came the message that finally stripped away whatever love I'd still been using to protect him. It arrived from an unknown number just after midnight. At first I assumed it was spam, until I opened the attachment. Security footage. Black and white driveway video from the Hale house. Time-stamped the night they locked me outside. I watched silently as Ethan stood behind me on the porch while Walter closed the door. Judith remained visible through the front window, holding Oliver's diaper bag in her arms like she had already decided it belonged there permanently. Then the camera caught something I had not seen that night. Ethan handed Walter a folder before the door shut. A legal folder. 2 minutes later, another text arrived beneath the video. "You deserve to know the truth. Brielle Sutton." I stared at the screen, while snow drifted softly beyond the cottage windows. And for the first time since marrying Ethan Hale, I stopped asking myself how to save my marriage. I started asking how far they had planned to go. 3 days later, I walked into Eleanor Voss's law office, carrying Oliver in his infant carrier, and a diaper bag filled with evidence instead of bottles. The office sat on the top floor of an old brick building downtown, quiet except for the muted ticking of a wall clock and the occasional hiss of radiators fighting the February cold. Eleanor herself looked exactly like the kind of woman wealthy families feared in court, silver hair cut sharply at the jawline, dark suit, no wasted movement anywhere in her body. She didn't offer sympathy. Strangely, that made me trust her immediately. For nearly an hour, she reviewed documents without interruption, while Oliver slept beside her desk. Every so often, she'd underline something with a fountain pen, or ask for clarification in the same calm tone surgeons use, discussing complicated procedures. "When exactly did your husband begin restricting account access? How many times did his mother reference your foster care history? Did anyone explicitly suggest you were emotionally unstable before childbirth?" Not emotional questions. Pattern questions. By the end of the meeting, the neat stack of papers beside Eleanor had become something uglier than marital conflict. I could see it in her expression. "This was coordinated," she said finally. The room went very still. I had known it already, somewhere deep inside myself, but hearing another person say it out loud made the truth feel suddenly solid and unavoidable. Before I could respond, the receptionist buzzed through the intercom. "Mrs. Hale is here with her husband." Eleanor glanced at me once. I assumed they might come. Apparently, Ethan had spent 2 days calling every hospital and clinic in Rochester, trying to locate Oliver and me after discovering our joint accounts had been frozen pending legal review. Eleanor had arranged the meeting deliberately. "People reveal themselves faster when they think they still have control," she said quietly. Ethan entered first. For one painful second, my chest tightened automatically at the sight of him. Love does not disappear cleanly just because betrayal arrives. He looked exhausted, same gray wool coat, same tired eyes I had once believed meant he was carrying too much responsibility for everyone else. Now I knew better. Judith followed behind him, carrying herself with perfect composure, leather gloves folded neatly in one hand. She barely looked at me before focusing on Oliver's carrier instead. "There he is," she said softly. Not hello. Not are you okay. Just immediate possession. Ethan sat across from me at the conference table and leaned forward carefully, like someone approaching a wounded animal. "Cass," he began quietly, "this has gotten out of hand." I almost laughed. Out of hand. Like the snowstorm had simply escalated accidentally on its own. "You locked me outside with our son," I said. Judith inhaled sharply before Ethan could answer. "That is an unfair characterization." Eleanor finally spoke for the first time since they arrived. "No," she said evenly, sliding the printed driveway footage across the table. "It's a documented one." Silence dropped heavily into the room. Ethan's face changed the instant he recognized the security footage still frame. Then Eleanor placed a second folder beside it. Debt summaries, betting transactions, custody drafts, property record requests tied to Evelyn Mercer's trust. One by one, carefully arranged. I watched the exact moment Ethan realized I no longer stood alone inside the story his family had built about me. Judith recovered first. "This is becoming hostile," she said coldly. Eleanor folded her hands. "No, Mrs. Hale," she replied. Hostile was locking a postpartum mother outside during a snowstorm while preparing emergency custody paperwork. Ethan lowered his eyes to the table. For the first time since I met him, he looked afraid. Then Eleanor delivered the sentence that shifted the balance of power completely. Given the financial concealment involved, she said calmly, we are also preparing documentation for a formal investigation into Walter Hale's asset transfers through Hale Logistics. And suddenly, Judith stopped looking untouchable too. That meeting should have felt victorious. For weeks, maybe months, I had lived inside a version of reality carefully arranged by the Hale family, a reality where I was unstable, emotional, ungrateful, confused. Sitting in Eleanor Voss's office while their polished certainty finally cracked apart should have satisfied something inside me. Instead, I went home exhausted. Not physically, spiritually. Vincent must have sensed it the moment I stepped into the cottage that evening because he didn't ask questions. He simply took Oliver from his carrier with surprising gentleness and carried him toward the living room while I stood in the kitchen staring at nothing. Outside, snow drifted slowly past the windows in soft gray spirals. The storm had finally weakened, but the world still looked frozen. I found something, Vincent said quietly after a while. When I looked up, he was holding a long cream-colored envelope worn thin along the edges from age. My breath caught instantly. Even before he handed it to me, I knew. Somehow, I knew. It was in your mother's storage file, he said carefully. I never opened it. I couldn't. My hands felt strangely numb as I took the envelope from him. The paper smelled faintly of dust and cedar, like something kept hidden for years inside a closed drawer. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, was one word: Cassandra. My knees nearly gave out. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table while Oliver slept nearby in his portable bassinet, tiny breaths lifting and falling beneath a pale blue blanket. Vincent stepped outside onto the porch without another word, giving me privacy I hadn't realized I needed so badly. For a long moment, I simply stared at the envelope. All my life, my mother had existed as an absence. No voice, no explanation, just silence. Then finally, with shaking fingers, I opened it. The letter inside was shorter than I expected. That hurt somehow too. Emily. No. Cassandra. Need consistency. Let's fix. Will not mention mistake. Need continue seamlessly. We need correct, without acknowledging. We can still do it by saying, my full name written carefully. Better restart from after open? We need avoid inconsistency. Let's craft cleanly. That meeting should have felt victorious. For weeks, maybe months, I had lived inside a version of reality, carefully arranged by the Hale family, a reality where I was unstable, emotional, ungrateful, confused. Sitting in Eleanor Voss's office while their polished certainty finally cracked apart should have satisfied something inside me. Instead, I went home exhausted. Not physically, spiritually. Vincent must have sensed it the moment I stepped into the cottage that evening because he didn't ask questions. He simply took Oliver from his carrier with surprising gentleness and carried him toward the living room while I stood in the kitchen staring at nothing. Outside, snow drifted slowly past the windows in soft gray spirals. The storm had finally weakened, but the world still looked frozen. I found something, Vincent said quietly after a while. When I looked up, he was holding a long cream-colored envelope worn thin along the edges from age. My breath caught instantly. Even before he handed it to me, I knew. Somehow, I knew. It was in your mother's storage file, he said carefully. I never opened it, I couldn't. My hands felt strangely numb as I took the envelope from him. The paper smelled faintly of dust and cedar, like something kept hidden for years inside a closed drawer. Across the front, written in faded blue ink, was my name, Cassandra. My knees nearly gave out. I sat down slowly at the kitchen table while Oliver slept nearby in his portable bassinet, tiny breaths lifting and falling beneath a pale blue blanket. Vincent stepped outside onto the porch without another word, giving me privacy I hadn't realized I needed so badly. For a long moment, I simply stared at the envelope. All my life, my mother, had existed as an absence. No voice, no explanation, just silence. Then finally, with shaking fingers, I opened it. The letter inside was shorter than I expected. That hurt somehow too. Not because she had written too little, but because every line felt like something written by a woman running out of time. Cassandra, if you are reading this, then I did not get far enough away to come back for you myself. My vision blurred immediately. I pressed my hand hard against my mouth, trying to steady my breathing, while the cottage radiator clicked softly in the corner, and Oliver shifted in his sleep beside me. Your whole life, someone may tell you I left because I did not love you enough. Do not believe that. I left because I loved you too much to let fear become your first language. Tears slid down my face before I even realized I was crying. She wrote about hiding bus money inside coffee tins, about memorizing schedules, about sleeping with her shoes on, because she never knew when she might need to run. She wrote that she had been trying to leave quietly for months before everything collapsed. And then came the line that broke something open inside me completely. If fear becomes home, children begin mistaking survival for love. I stared at those words for a long time, because suddenly my marriage looked different too. The constant tension, the walking carefully, the apologizing for things that were never really mine to fix, the desperate gratitude every time Ethan showed me basic kindness after cruelty. I had built an entire adult life around enduring what frightened me. At the bottom of the letter, my mother had written one final sentence in smaller, shakier handwriting. You do not owe anyone your suffering in exchange for belonging. By then, I was crying hard enough my shoulders shook, not only from grief, from recognition. Outside the cottage window, I could see Vincent standing alone on the porch beneath the weak yellow light, hands deep in his coat pockets, while snow drifted quietly around him. 22 years ago, he had arrived too late to save my mother. But sitting there with her letter trembling in my hands and my son sleeping safely beside me, I realized something that changed me forever. I was not too late to save myself. The collapse of the Hale family did not happen all at once. People like Walter and Judith spent decades building lives designed to look untouchable from the outside. Their names sat on charity boards. Their photographs appeared in hospital fundraising brochures and country club newsletters. Men shook Walter's hand at business dinners because they believed he represented stability. Women admired Judith because she knew how to perform kindness beautifully in public. But reputations are fragile things once the right cracks appear. Trevor Gaines turned out to be the first crack. 2 weeks after I read my mother's letter, Eleanor received a package delivered anonymously to her office. Inside were internal accounting records from Hale Logistics, printed emails, and offshore transfer summaries connected to Walter's accounts. Trevor had apparently spent years quietly saving copies after realizing company money was being shifted through shell vendors during periods of financial loss. Once federal auditors became involved, everything accelerated. Contracts paused. Investors started asking questions. People at the country club stopped returning Judith's calls. The strange thing about powerful families is that their social circle often survives on confidence more than loyalty. The moment confidence disappears, people begin backing away carefully, like guests leaving a house fire before smoke reaches their own clothes. Ethan lost his position at Hale Logistics before the investigation formally concluded. Walter framed it publicly as a temporary leave, but nobody really believed that. Not after the custody draft surfaced in legal filings. Not after Brielle Sutton's driveway footage quietly circulated farther than the Hales expected. And through all of it, I noticed something surprising. I no longer wanted revenge. There had been a time earlier in the marriage when I thought justice meant making people hurt exactly the way they hurt you. But surviving the Hales taught me something different. Some people destroy themselves simply by being forced into the light. The final custody hearing happened in late March. Snow still lined parts of the courthouse parking lot in dirty gray piles, but the air had softened enough to hint at spring underneath it. Oliver slept through most of the proceedings in Eleanor's assistant's arms, while lawyers finalized supervised visitation terms and temporary financial arrangements. Walter never looked at me once. Judith did. But for the first time since meeting her, I saw uncertainty beneath the elegance. Her clothes were immaculate as always, pearl earrings perfectly placed, posture flawless. Yet something essential had shifted. She no longer looked like a woman controlling a room. She looked tired. After the hearing ended, Ethan stopped me outside the courtroom while Eleanor walked ahead, carrying files. Cass. I turned slowly. He stood there with both hands in his coat pockets, shoulders slightly bent inward like someone carrying invisible weight. He looked older than 38 suddenly, not because life had punished him dramatically, but because consequences had finally arrived and stayed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question I think had been haunting him since the night of the storm. Do you hate me? I thought about it honestly. About the porch, the snow, the custody filing, the years spent making myself smaller to fit inside a family that only valued me when I was powerless. And strangely, the answer came easily. No, I said quietly. His face tightened slightly. Why not? Because hate still gives someone a place inside you. I looked past him toward the courthouse windows, where pale sunlight reflected across the glass. My mother spent her whole life trapped in fear, I said. I'm not building another home out of it. Ethan lowered his eyes then, and for the first time since I had known him, he had nothing left to say.